now that we've done the intro, let's dive straight into it. What are we going to cover today?
All right. So today we're going to double click into measurement, and we're going to specifically talk about those three pillars: experimentation, attribution, modeling. Try to give some examples again about what each of them mean, why they're important, and some use cases, if we have time, some use cases on how to apply them to the business so you can start asking the right questions in your organization, both internally as well as externally with partners or platforms that you use.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think as Bryan was just saying, our goal is we want to make this a highly actionable series for you all. And so we'll make sure to be able to say things that you can take back and say, okay, is this type of question or is this other type of question, right? So let's just start with the definitions of each of them, right? So let's start with the definitions of each of our three pillars. You want to start with attribution?
Yeah, attribution. So attribution is really nothing more than the platform or the channel telling you what credit it believes it deserves. It doesn't mean that that's the actual credit, or it doesn't mean that it's, over-reporting always or that it's under-reporting. It just means this is what the platform believes it deserves. A lot of this is going to be dependent on how the settings are configured, how well, or the sort of the signal integrity of that platform, as well as it's able to receive those conversion events back to it. And it's almost like analytics tools fall under attribution as well, right? Adobe and Google Analytics, both very commonly used platforms for analytics tracking. They are for attribution. They give you the attribution of what it believes these specific channels or what your marketing mix deserves credit for.
Yeah, makes sense. So I think under attribution, there's a few different types, right? I've heard of things like single and multi-touch, and then yesterday somebody was saying there's a difference between multi-touch and multiple. I'll let that somebody describe what the difference is between the different ones.
Yeah, so it's funny. Attribution, so specifically attribution has other layers to it, right? There is a single touch point. A single touch point is going to be stuff like last click or first click. You're essentially assigning credit to one touch point, hence the name, of how that ad or that media affected desired outcomes. Then you have multiple touch point, not to be confused with multi-touch, but multiple touch point. And that's where you're assigning credit to two touch points. And the common ones are like first and last click, meaning you're going to give credit to the ad that was sort of the entry or the gateway into your brand, but also help drive that last conversion. Very valuable because it gives you kind of a perspective of ads that, again, drove awareness and drove consideration, but it also gives credit to the ads that drove that final conversion, that final sale. And then the last one is data-driven. And data-driven is where you essentially have a variable credit that's assigned. So first touch and multi touch point, those you're giving credits that are static, right? So it's always going to be 100% credit or 40% credit, and it's across the entire media. With data-driven, that credit, that 20% or 40% is going to move up and down based off of where the touch point occurred, and it's also going to move up and down based off of the channel that you're looking at. So with email, you might give 70% credit to the last touch points. And then with Facebook ads or YouTube, you might give a higher credit for the touch points that were early on in the stages. So it's variable. It's going to fluctuate based off of the channel and the tactic. And it's meant to give you
a mess.
It is an absolute mess. It's complicated.
It sounds like the way that platforms try to game you for more money. That's what it sounds like to me. I'm sitting at a brand and thinking different weights and email is last touch, and it's man, sounds like vendors are going to try to extract dollars.
I'll say it's an attempt to give a more honest view, and that's the intent behind it. But unfortunately, with data-driven attribution, it is a bit of a black box.
Yeah.
MTA, multi-touch attribution, it got very, very popular during the rise of digital advertising. Because vendors and tools and platforms were pushing it as hey, this is a more honest view. But as time has gone on, there's a lot of pitfalls with MTA, with data-driven attribution, right? One, it requires a touch point. So how do you measure print? How do you measure billboards or radio or audio, right? It's incredibly difficult. And those channels have an influence. So we're actually going to get into modeling, which helps overcome some of those gaps. I think there is value in MTA, but for us, where we've been able to really leverage attribution is analyzing first touch and last touch, and seeing what % of sales are coming from first touch in an ad, and how does that compare to last touch. And if you see a lot of sales coming from first touch and not a lot in last touch, well, that's telling you that this ad is really good at grabbing attention, and it's great for introducing people to the brand, but it's not very good at conversions. And if you have the opposite, it means you have an ad that is great at conversions, but not very good at driving awareness. So as a brand, you really have to find that balance of how much are you willing to invest in an ad that's terrible from last click or last touch, and how much are you willing to invest in an ad that only drives direct response, last touch, but may not be driving, filling your upper funnel. So you do have to play that balance, but it's important to look at both.
Yeah. And I think critically, the thing that you said earlier was like, okay, if you're listening to this, hopefully you go back and you ask 2 questions. One, is what is happening in this tool single touch, multiple touch, or multi-touch? So that way, like now I know what language is being spoken in this sort of context. And then given that that's true, how should I then think about how to use this data, right? Which is going to differ by brand. And so like it's really important to not take a one-size-fits-all approach and instead to say, okay, now I understand what this means. I can go back and analyze and say, okay, I happen to be looking at a first click model here, but actually Bryan was just telling me, hey, there's actually multiple touches. I wonder how I can look at that. And then there's multi-touch. What happens if I start to take a multi-touch view and start to understand, are there other steps in the journey that led to this, right? But you touched on, okay, now modeling can come in and experimentation can come in. So let's just quickly define those 2 for people. Let's start with experimentation, just because it's sort of like, I would call it more, if we progress in the different buckets, it's like right next to attribution, and then modeling is sort of, you're no longer taking any, you're not trying to tie signals together, but I'll let you describe what experimentation is.
And it's funny, we called those sort of pillars of measurement in that order, because that's kind of the order of which you start to activate them as your brand grows. So you're going to start with attribution. Totally. It is the easiest and most accessible. Google Analytics is free. Anyone can look at attribution. But then once you're at a certain stage, you're going to look at experimentation. Now, experimentation, whereas attribution was what the platform says it deserves credit for, experimentation is more what it actually drove, what it actually deserves credit for. The issue with experimentation, it's only in a snapshot of time. So what experimentation is essentially, it's kind of like an A/B test, right? You have media that's running to, say, half of the country, and you are not running any ads to the other side of the country. And so with experimentation, you're able to very easily detect what amount of sales volume is happening from the part of the country that's receiving your ad dollars. And you can compare that against the baseline, which is the control or the holdout. So it's a very, very clean, scientific way of measuring what incrementality is occurring from your media spend against that baseline. Again, the issue with experimentation is that it's not an always-on tactic. So let's say I run an experiment for connected TV ads, and we are doing a match market test. So we show media to a couple of different states, and we don't run any media to the rest of the country. If I run that test in Q1, that shopping behavior is not going to be the same throughout the entire year. So if I run the test in Q1, I see that I'm getting certain results. I have to be mindful that in Q3 or in Q4 or Q1 of next year, those results may be completely different.
Totally.
And so it's great for confirmation and using that guidance, but it's only a snapshot. So it's accurate, but again, it's a snapshot in time, and it can also be very expensive because you need to drive a certain amount of lift for it to be meaningful and for you to have statistical significance in the results that are being shown.
Okay, got it. And I'm going to use the word statistics as my segue into modeling, right? So,
yeah.
So like, help us define like, how do you do modeling? And I think like oftentimes the terminology people use is like media mix modeling or mixed media modeling. And so how do you think about when to start doing modeling and what it can be useful for?
Yeah. So with modeling is basically the attempt of replicating experimentation, but over a long period of time. The great thing about modeling is, you're getting more accurate reads on what is actually being driven by your media dollars. The bad thing is that it's not always accurate. So you do need to have some calibration. And it's why it's important to go in that order. Get comfortable with the attribution, with attribution analytics, then get comfortable with experimentation. And once you have a good amount of experimentation on your belt and you have those results, you can feed those results, those incremental return on ad spend or those incremental cost per acquisitions. You can feed that into the model to calibrate it. So what will happen is, let's say you have all of your impressions, your spend, your clicks, your reported revenue across all your marketing efforts, and then you'll have your actual revenue. What a model will do is it'll look for the correlation and the impacts that these different metrics have to the total revenue. But it's a model. It's not going to be 100% accurate. So what you do is you run an experiment and you get the results from that experiment and you sort of layer that on top of the model and you tell the model, hey, your results need to be showing this output. And so the model will course correct itself to align with the actual results, and then that influences the rest of the model. So you run a few calibration points throughout the year, once or twice a year, you're able to then have a model that's more accurate without the need of running experiments every single day. You run 2 experiments a year, you have a model that fills in the gaps for the rest of the year.
Awesome. All right. So I feel like now I have a really good sort of way of thinking about what sort of measurement I need to be doing. So when I start off and I'm just starting my brand, start with attribution. Probably most people are doing single touch or multiple touch through their platform, right? And then they can create a setting in GA. And we'll dive into this in future episodes on the MTA side or data-driven side. From there, quote unquote, move into or graduate into experimentation. At this point, you need to have a larger budget, which is why you do need to wait for the progression of your brand in order to run those experiments. And then you have to take those outputs in order to train a model to be effective and to actually do that media mix modeling. Now, the really good thing that modeling does for us is that it reduces our reliance on cross-device or cross-site tracking because it just takes inputs from each section independently, and that's being used as the input against the model, which has been trained against real outcomes, right? And so actually modeling is from even before the internet, right? So there was no way of doing cross anything tracking. And so you get these sort of ways to think about the world that are actually highly effective, but you do have to sort of move into it or have enough budget to get there, right? And so that's super important for people to realize. And hopefully an action you can take back with you is, okay, I feel like here's what I need to understand for my brand and here are the types of questions I need to be asking. And so hopefully you can go back and do that.
Yeah. And there's a sort of a revolution that's occurring right now in the measurement world. One, these models, they're not complex. There is a vast amount of resources where you can build your own model in-house. You can go find a data analyst. If they know programming languages such as R, you give them the resources, they unload the package for the model, they take all of your performance data, and they build a model themselves in-house. Now, I would advise that you work with a data analyst that has experience building these, or else it's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. But you can build a model in-house. With that being said, I'm seeing more and more companies pop up to do this for you. And this has been a tool or a method of measurement that has been out of reach for a lot of direct-to-consumer brands. And it's why it's unfamiliar. It's sort of new territory because it's typically been an enterprise solution. Same with MTA, right? You started to see a couple of more measurement tools and platforms that are now providing MTA, and now they're also starting to provide modeling. So it's something that we all have to get very comfortable with. I think as you called out, once cookies go away and we really start to become more privacy centric than what we are, modeling is going to be and experimentation are going to be the sort of the go-to to get an honest read on what's happening with your media dollars.
Yeah, totally. And so, I mean, I think now people should have like a really clear point of view on sort of what to be asking and what to sort of take away from this. I think in next episode, we want to dive into like a couple of highly specific things on the attribution side, right? So for our next episode, we're going to dive into the question of what is the difference and why is there a difference between what I'm seeing on Facebook and what I'm seeing on my GA? And we'll start to sort of unpack, hey, what are the different platforms able to show you and why are those numbers different and how do you use them? And actually, in many cases, they're different from your own Shopify data too, or your own e-com backend data, whatever platform you're using, right? And so, yeah, stay tuned for the next one.